What's up, everybody? Matt Gajeski here, back again with the Stokastic DFS channel, talking some college football DFS. It's the Thanksgiving slate, not just NFL, but we have the Egg Bowl. Mississippi State takes on Ole Miss. We'll dive into everything you need to know, but before we get started, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live. We're also brought to you today by Prize Picks, where you're making lineups with player props, overs, unders, passing yards, touchdowns, everything, you name it. And they have more than just college football and NFL, NBA, NHL. You can mix and match these in your lineups if you're an expert in multiple sports. And better yet, they have a first match deposit bonus up to $100 and 1 free month of Stokastic Plus Platinum when you click the link in the video description below. So make sure to check out Prize Picks. Diving into the slate, we'll bring you to our player data usage tool. Just one game for this video. It's a showdown. Ole Miss and Mississippi State, the Egg Bowl. It is -2 in favor of Ole Miss, so excuse that there. Really thought I had this correct this time, but I will go back and change it. So -2, 59 total here. Mississippi State, they're the away team. We'll start there. They're 44th in pace, 70% pass rate, pace the country in this metric. They run the Mike Leach air raid. Will Rogers is the signal caller. He's the most expensive captain on the slate if you choose to do so. He is negative 135 rushing yards, but he's averaging 314 as a passer on 42 attempts. So the efficiency has taken a slight step back this year for Will Rogers, but still averaging more than 300 yards per game. And he's likely to do so here in what looks like an up-tempo game environment. So right away, he's playable. I have a lot of interest in potentially saving some money here and maybe going to a different captain just because Will Rogers does have some downside with that negative rushing. He kind of is reliant on a 300-yard bonus, but again, he's more likely than not to achieve that with Ole Miss's elevated pass rate. He's nearly throwing the ball 50 times a game, which is downright silly. But in the run game, big injury piece to talk about is Dillon Johnson. He played 1 snap last week, and without him, they've moved more to Jo'quavious Marks. I don't think this is what they want to do. I think they want to play with Dillon Johnson as more of like a 50-50, 60-40 type back if they can. He only, again, 1 snap was pretty egregious. And last week, Jo'quavious Marks played 32 snaps. We actually had J.J. Jernigan playing 40, but there's a ton of noise here. Like Mississippi State played East Tennessee State. So when it comes down to it, competitive games like the one we have here, I think it's Jo'quavious Marks, 60% of the snaps roughly. Dillon Johnson, 40% roughly if he's healthy. And then again, if Johnson's out for whatever reason, Jernigan would likely fill that role, but most of it would go to Marks. On the year, Marks is averaging 14.2 touches per game. A lot of that coming via targets. He averages 5.1 targets per game. Dillon Johnson's basically the same role, just slightly less. 4.3 targets per game, 12.1 touches for him. Both are solid plays in tournaments. In the run game, in the pass game, this is where we could get some potential leverage for GPPs. This is an awesome spot to target on the year. There's going to be a ton of ownership on certain guys, or at least I expect there to be, with plenty of potential pivots. So I'll bring you kind of behind the scenes. I think one thing we can do here is just look at the projections and try to figure out, okay, which of these guys is going to be popular? And I think it's going to sort of condense around a few of them. The first one being Rufus Harvey. He's had an excellent role of late, and the routes are there for him. Like, none of these players really participate in drastically more than 50% of the routes on a week-to-week basis. It's because they play so many guys. So for this game, I think Rufus Harvey might generate a good amount of ownership here. And the reason why is the routes have been there for him. You look at the last couple games, he was at 68% before last week's game against East Tennessee State. So he's likely going to be popular, I would guess. And from there, you have Ra Thomas. He's had a pretty good year, a bit more expensive. I'm trying to bring up the projections on the back end just so I can read them for you guys. For some reason, it's been a little tricky for me to find. But, all right, so I got them up now. Yeah, Ra and Caleb Ducking project as the 2 highest. And, that makes some sense here. But they're both expensive. Ra Thomas and Caleb Ducking. Again, Rufus Harvey, I think, comes in with more ownership. So sorry this wasn't up to begin with. I had targets up, but I wanted to look at raw projection just so we could find out where the ownership comes in more than likely. So to break it all down, you've got three main receivers here: Thomas, Rufus Harvey, Caleb Ducking. 66 targets for Thomas, 66 for Harvey, 59 for Ducking. Very little separates them in terms of yardage. Rah's been the most efficient, 599 yards. Rufus Harvey's at 430, Ducking's at 449. But there's a price difference between them. Rufus Harvey is significantly cheaper than Ducking and Thomas, so he's much easier to fit. So Rufus is probably going to garner a lot more ownership at this point in the week. And again, the routes mirror this. Like, Rufus Harvey has the second highest route rate on the team. It's behind only Ducking on the year. Ducking's at 58%. Harvey's at 54%. And Harvey actually played more than Ducking in their most recent competitive game. So I think he's the best play of the three. I also expect him to be the most owned. Rah's kind of the third man out. He has a 50% route rate, 49% in their most recent competitive game. And from there is where things get interesting. You've got Lydetrick Griffin, you've got Justin Robinson, Austin Williams, Jaden Wally, Jameer Calvin. Where do these guys fit in? So for price, you look across the board. Lydetrick's at 87, Justin Robinson's at 75, Austin Williams 45, Jaden Wally 3K, and Jameer Calvin 1.8. Very little separates these guys in terms of opportunity. Lydetrick leads the group with 42 targets, Justin Robinson 37, Austin Williams 36, Jaden Wally 36, and Jameer Calvin 21. So right away, to me, I think this is going to come down to the cheaper players get more ownership. A guy like Jameer Calvin, he missed a couple games. Last week, he returned 45% of the routes. He's not going to be as involved as the three guys we talked about at the top, like Rufus, and Caleb, but he's going to be on the field. And for 1.8K, he makes some sense there. But Wally also could make some sense. His route rate is 36% on the year. Austin Williams plays the most, but he's targeted the least. He has a 50% route rate. And Justin Robinson's at 32%. Lydetrick's at 45%. I think of this group, Austin Williams actually could make some sense as a buy low. He's one of the worst players on this team efficiency-wise, but his targets are some of the most consistent. 4.5 targets per game in the last three. That's solid numbers, and he's kind of in a no man's land for price. I sort of like him, but my plan for Mississippi State is to mix and match these receivers. Again, there's about 7 of them you can play. I would probably cut this off at Jameer Calvin. Scooby Ford, some people will play, but I don't have a ton of interest. And to rank them, just from a raw projection standpoint, we won't do price adjusted, but just here's who projects the best, trying to give you guys like a decent idea where to go. Number 1, we have Thomas. Number 2, it's Rufus Harvey. 3 is Ducking. 4 is Lydetrick Griffin. 5 is actually Jaden Wally. 5 is Austin Williams, then Jaden Wally, then Justin Robinson, followed by Jameer Calvin. Lot to break down, really nuanced position groups, so hopefully that makes sense. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. I'll answer 2v2s there, as well as Twitter at Matt_Gajeski. But let's dive into Ole Miss. They're 4th in pace. They have a 36.5% pass rate. Very run-based team, very fast under Lane Kiffin. Jackson Dart, 552 rushing yards in the year is awesome. Like, he's going to project similarly to Will Rogers because he's so mobile. He only averages 215 pass yards per game. That it doesn't matter because his mobility is so good. So in a 1-for-1 situation, like if you force me to play just one QB, I'm honestly debating between Rogers and Dart. And for large field tournaments, I might pick Dart because so many people are just going to pick Will Rogers at his price tag. It's the most expensive on the slate, but they see the box scores and how often he hits 300 yards. I think it's closer than that because of the rushing. The backfield, you probably just want to play both these guys, Quinshon Judkins and Zach Evans. Evans over his concussion. That's why he had 6 carries the week before. He's been banged up all year. But last week, 24 carries for Judkins, 17 for Zach Evans. These two guys are both going to see a hefty workload because of their really heavy run rate and how fast they play. Judkins has been awesome. He averages 126 yards per game on the ground, another 10 through the air. Evans, another 10 yards through the air himself, and he averages 89 on the ground. So very easy to play them both. I don't think that build's going to be as owned as it should be just because there's a little sticker shock playing 2 running backs in the same offense, but it makes some sense. They're both efficiently priced. Judkins should be the most expensive player in the slate, and he's not. The receiving game is very straightforward. They are using the same 3 receivers, and honestly, they've used 4 in the last couple games. Mingo, Heath, and Watkins are the top 4. Mingo and Heath are very, very close together. They each have 69 targets. Mingo leads the group with 768 yards. That's slightly ahead of Malik Heath, who's at 754. Mingo's cheaper, so he's just the better play in a vacuum. Heath would be your pay up to be contrarian option. Then Jordan Watkins plays every single snap, but he's pretty far behind those two. 40 targets on the year, 363 yards, but very playable at 5,700. Then the last wrinkle here, we saw Michael Trigg get injured early for this team. That put Casey Kelly on the field. Casey Kelly sort of lost his role, and then last week he got hurt. So that put Dayton Wade into like a 95% route share. 95%. He's had target counts of at least 4 in each of the last 3 games. Very inefficient, just 148 yards on the year for Dayton Wade, but he plays a ton. The only wrinkle in this is that Michael Trigg has suited up the last 2 games. He hasn't entered a game yet, but at what point does he play? Like, if Michael Trigg plays in this game, that's going to come directly out of Dayton Wade, but we just won't know. And even him warming up, suiting up isn't enough because he's done that the last 2 weeks and then he just hasn't seen the field, which seems to be injury related to me because he's better than Dayton Wade. He's better than Casey Kelly. We'll see. I don't know when Trigg is actually going to come back, if he's going to come back, but I think that gives a little bit of fragility to Dayton Wade. Those two become GPP options for me. But that'll do it for the showdown slate. A lot to dive into actually for this one. So if you have questions, leave a comment, and you can find me on Twitter at Matt_Gajeski if you'd like to ask directly. Otherwise, hit the thumbs up button on the way out, subscribe to the channel. Those both go a long way for us. And thank you if you've done so. Otherwise, we'll be back tomorrow. Thanksgiving hangover. It's the Friday slate. Make sure to check that out. Until then, good luck, guys. We'll see you then.